Much for making it out here. A quick word from us first. AGI House is an applied AI lab and a VC fund, and we're very happy to welcome you all to our office. And every once in a while, we throw these build days around topics that we believe in. So in this case, voice agents and full duplex models and all of this interesting research, and also around companies that we believe in. So on that note, I would love to introduce our first speaker, Kylan from Inworld.
Awesome. Cool.
Thank you for being our headline sponsor.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right, nice, it's working. All right, cool. Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm Kylan, CEO at Inworld. We build real-time models for consumer-facing applications. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about maybe one specific angle on voice agents, because I think that the last few years have had a, let's say, narrow definition of what a voice agent is and what it can do. Largely because, for a little bit of background, we started our company to largely solve the problem of how to help AI solve consumer-facing applications. And that led us towards voice. But what I've seen over the last few years is a lot of focus, for example, on things like customer support, CX, and certain domains for voice agents. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think people in the hackathon should maybe think about alternative approaches and alternative applications of voice agents. One, because it's hella saturated, and you'll probably find a lot of competition if you're building some customer support stuff. And two, because I think it's important for the world. And so what I want to talk about a little bit is, like, what does it mean to actually build voice agents for everyone, everywhere? And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Not like, you know, your lawyer or your marketer, but actually thinking about your grandma, your parents, and those kinds of things as well. Because ultimately, I think that's what matters. Cool, I guess we'll do this. So just some thoughts in terms of like what we do and why we build what we build. So my background, I was at DeepMind before. I built some of the early LLMs and text-to-speech. And what my job was to basically then take those products, or models at the time, and basically integrate them into Google products. And the trend that we saw, and this was like 8 years ago now, was that it quickly flowed in Google Cloud and a lot of enterprise applications. And it was super, super slow to reach a lot of Google products. As I think we've seen in the last couple of years, of course, like Google consumer products have been overflown with AI, but it took 7 years. And so I think when we look at the general impact of AI, I think it's pretty clear that it's greatly already transformed businesses. Costs are down. Everybody in this room can code things they probably couldn't have done a year ago. But the reality is that if you probably ask most people on the street, your parents, your grandparents, you know, how transformative has AI been for your life? They'll say, oh, I use ChatGPT when I have like a bad mole on my back, or I have like some kind of personal issue and I'll ask a question. But how does it change in terms of their daily behavior? My grandma still uses Duolingo every day to freshen up on Ukrainian. You know, there's a lot of these things I think that can transform people's lives, and I think it has not been realized. And if you think about like what do people do with their time? You know, they learn, they create, they connect, they get wellness. These are the kinds of things that I think will become more and more important, because the reality is AI will disrupt people's jobs. It will disrupt people's lives. It will change the fabric of social nature in our society, and yet it's not, I feel like, compensated with the benefits of what AI does for people personally. And this is something I think is really, really important, because there is 0% chance that in the next 10 years, our lives, our kids' lives, our parents' lives are going to be disrupted. And yet I do not think that we've done a good job of actually building AI products that benefit them. And I think that's a very important thing for today and what you're thinking about and building for the future. And so at the end of the day, I don't think you need a lot to build for these types of applications to serve these users. You need to figure out interfaces that work for them. And interfaces that work for most people are ones that are human, ones that are natural. What's human and natural? Conversation, what we're doing right now. The ability to basically have a real-time conversation with people, to engage them, to be able to relate in the way that they usually do. And also, I'll share an interesting stat on this. So we've, of course, been focusing on powering a lot of different consumer applications across games, language learning, education, fitness. And what's been really interesting is, specifically in the last 6 months, there's been a shift. And the shift was that about 6 months ago, if you looked at an application that had, oh, that's okay, sorry, I've died. Had, for example, you know, text and voice. If you looked at the users that would, for example, use an optional voice feature, it was something like 10% of users that would ever use it. And 90% would always default to text. This is a really interesting behavior. You can ask anyone that's built a scaled application, introduce a voice feature, they'd say, I introduced it, it became a cool side feature because nobody engaged with it. But what we've seen is in the last 6 months that has completely flipped. And the reason I think for this is, if you watch your parents, for example, interact with their Google Home or their Alexa, you'll notice that they don't speak naturally. They say, hey Google, What's the weather in Arizona right now? And it's like, that's not how you speak to a human. And so what we've noticed is, as the quality of voice understanding has gotten better, as the quality of voice output has gotten better, it has felt a lot more similar to a natural human conversation. And I think the reason why that matters is that there's a cognitive dissonance or a cognitive load that's required when you have to translate how you interact to how the computer or the machine wants you to interact. And that cognitive load is very stressful for people who are not like the people in this room and are not technical. And therefore, they'll say, hey, I'm going to do what I know how to do. I'm going to click on static buttons, and I'm going to type my text. But now that that conversation has gotten to a quality bar that is good enough, we're seeing behavior change rapidly. And people are starting to adopt this at like crazy paces. We've seen every application that we power add voice features. They've seen like 20% increases in retention. And it's rapidly changing every day as we see those small quality bars come up. And I'll talk about what that is. But I think that's an extremely, extremely important change because we're finally at the point where this is ready to reach the mass market, everyone, everywhere. And all you really need is you need text-to-speech to have voice out. You need speech-to-text to be able to understand speech. You need an LLM to be able to do some reasoning. And ideally, you have this kind of package in a real-time API or a speech-to-speech mode. That's what you need, and then probably you can ask Claude Code to look at docs and build whatever the heck you want for your users. Those are the things that underlying what you need to build this. And so overall, though, the kind of main story here is I think we're moving from an era where a lot of the wins in AI came from efficiency to a world where we're moving towards experience. And primarily, who does that mean? Efficiency was impacting businesses. How does that impact everybody's lives? Well, they get a little bit better at their job or they lose their job. How does it affect them in experience? Well, that's basically the other 16 hours in the day. Well, maybe they don't listen to it when they're sleeping, although I think it's cool to even think about AI like night casts. What is the rest of their experience, and how does AI impact the rest of that? What we're seeing is text moved first in the way that basically people got used to Cursor, ChatGPT, Claude. But now we're seeing voice basically come up as a new modality, and you see this in all the primary providers. And I think the reason for that is, voice is actually much older than text. We've had human conversations in voice for much longer than we've had text conversations. Most people weren't literate. They didn't read, they didn't write. They still all had conversations. And so actually voice is a much more natural, organic way for humans to interact. And I think that's why we're seeing that demographic shift. And so some things just about what I think is interesting and why I want to kind of make a pitch for people to think about this consumer space. One, because I think it's socially important, but two, because I think it actually can have business value. First of all, it has huge reach. If you build an application that reaches consumers, you can have hundreds of millions of daily users. Many of the applications we power, ones that you've never heard of, have tens of millions of daily users. Each of those users spends 90 minutes a day on the app. That's a heck of a lot of usage. If you build something in, for example, like a CX space, it can be engaging, but how much time in a day do you want to spend on a support call? Probably zero. You really don't want to have any, but you will do it. So if you're building for that application, you have to touch a lot of users. If you can create an application that engages people and they spend a lot of time in, you actually need a much lower amount of users to be able to get that same value out. The second thing is there's this kind of dense recurring engagement. You want to find an application or an experience that allows you to consistently find something people come back to every day. Things like language learning, wellness, horoscopes, basically therapy, health, things that people are literally like, I want to progress on this area of my life, so I'm going to come back to this app every single day for 90 minutes a day so that I can make that progress. That's what you want because those are the people that are going to pay your subscriptions, they're going to pay your usage fees, and they're basically going to pay your bills. That's ultimately what this comes down to. And the last one is that there's also kind of a flip right now where I think probably for the last few years it's been way too expensive to basically touch the consumer space. These people pay $5 a month, 5% of them pay, and so you've got to kind of amortize across all your users. As we see now, DeepSeek V4 Flash is now 30 times cheaper than Gemini 3.6 Flash while being more intelligent. That means now that we have the same level of intelligence for a much lower dollar. And that means now that it's the time to basically scale this up. What does scale mean? Well, we've got to reach consumers. Also, just from a business perspective, consumer space moves super fast. If you're trying to build your business around enterprise sales cycles, you're probably not going to get revenue for the next 2 years. If you're building something for consumers, you can get your next dollar basically in the next hour if you can figure out some ads. The other thing is that basically the usage scales continuously. This means that as you get more users on your platform and they spend more time and you do a better job, you're going to make more money. Basically, that means you have more compounding effects without having to, for example, scale out a sales team. And finally, basically, the scale allows you to better fit to the market, which means you build the differentiation simply by being able to scale. So once you reach those users, once you build for them, basically you naturally will fit your product and your workload and everything to them, and therefore you will be differentiated. You will have a moat simply by figuring out how to scale with that specific user base. So a way to think about this, or like what you would build for. So maybe people came in with hackathon ideas already, but one way maybe to think about it, the domain you want to tackle is, first of all, like how many applications out there exist that serve this specific market? Next, basically, well, this is the question. How many applications, or in your case, maybe if you're thinking about a product, how many features do you have that kind of tackle this specific problem? How many users can actually engage with it? Is it, is the market size 1 million people if you're building kind of a very niche health product? Is it something like wellness where basically anybody in the world can be affected? You want to find something that has that penetration point, but the key thing is you also want to find something where people will spend useful time. How much time in the day are they willing to give to this application? Because if you build something that's really great, but people will spend a minute a day, check-in apps. People always build these check-in apps. If people are checking in for 1 minute a day, it's a very, very small amount of usage. So you're not going to be able to get much value out of that. If you build something like a journaling app or like a wellness app where someone's coming in and spending 3 hours a day engaging with this thing, that is an incredible amount of value. You are creating an incredible amount of connection with that user. And finally, you want to figure out how much of the workload share can you own. So for example, if you're building an application, you want to basically own as much of the pipeline as you can. Probably people in this room, other than the 10 student folks, can't build chips, right? So you can't own that part of it. But the question is, how do you build something that you actually own end to end? Like 2 years ago, we had this conversation around like wrappers, right, as a thing. But the question is more, what do you basically own in that end-to-end pipeline? Do you own the UX, or are you using someone else's UX? Do you own the model? That might be hard, so maybe you can figure out a way to basically prompt or figure it out. But the matter is, like, how much of that do you own such that you can use towards your differentiation? And so I think that the key thing here is, and some of the lessons that I've learned about voice that I want to share. So for example, first of all, quality is very varied. If you look at any use case, you look at any user, quality is going to have a completely definition for every person. If you talk to people in this room and you go and have 10 conversations and you ask who had the best conversation, everybody's going to have different answers. People prefer different things in conversation. So you need to be really sensitive to what is the thing that quality means for this specific type of user, or even for a specific person. If you're building a language learning application, a grandma in Texas probably wants a different experience than a 20-year-old who's going to go to Thailand for spring break in Florida. And you want to figure out what is the different type of interaction that they have. What is the way that they want to learn a language? How do they get motivated? What types of conversations do they have? The second part is you need to think about cost, of course. A lot of people build great demos that if you scaled up would cost thousands of dollars per hour. Super cool, but basically you need to be able to optimize around this. And that means you need to find providers that are cheap. You need to think a little bit about that. You need to think about your basically unit economics per hour of interaction. Those kinds of things become extremely important because you have this repeated, consistent usage. And finally, a really interesting point, we've had multiple customers find over time that there's a direct correlation between latency and revenue, specifically. And the reason for that is people have got used to static interfaces for the last 20 years. So they got used to their chat apps, they've got used to their desktop apps, to the websites. They're used to clicking around buttons. And so when they interact with a conversational experience, they're expecting something different. They're expecting it to be fast. They're expecting it to feel natural. So as soon as latency goes above something like 600 milliseconds for a back and forth response, what happens cognitively is someone goes, oh, this is cool, but it's pretty much the same type of experience or the value that I get per minute as the static application that I'm used to. So I'm just going to go back to that and stop using the voice. So basically, if you don't have a real-time, voice, if you have something that takes, for example, a very long time to get responses, users will default away from your application or from the real-time features and back to the static ones. Therefore, you need to be very sensitive to latency. So basically just saying, quality matters differently for each person, cost matters at scale, and latency actually has a business impact. Finally, to think about things like concurrency, if you're scaling up to millions of users, you've got to figure out how you're going to handle all of those requests at the same time. Reliability is super important. Like, it's a hackathon, so not probably a problem here. But if you scale up and you have an hour of outage when you're building out your user base, that's going to be catastrophic because they're all going to jump over to your other competitor and worry about the next time they're going to have an outage. And finally, You also need to think about, over time, how do you develop kind of your rubric for quality aligned with that kind of first point? How do you develop evaluation sets that you'll know you'll progress against, that you know basically align with your users? And that's just something as like a founder, creator, or builder that you want to constantly iterate on. What is your scorecard for success? And so kind of to summarize this all, I'll skip over this slide actually, we got time. So just to give an overview of what Inworld does as part of this, primarily we build models. So we have our text-to-speech model, speech-to-text model, we have a real-time API that coordinates all of this, and we have our LLM API, which allows you to access our first-party hosted models on our real-time inference, as well as third-party models. This is what we primarily focus on. Our team has really split between two areas. We have inference, we have models, and we have, of course, the APIs around that. On the model side, we right now have the top TTS, STT, and we now actually have the fastest and cheapest inference for real-time LLMs as well. The real-time API is a way to package it all together, so you package in things like turn-taking, interruptions. So if you want to try something today, for example, to use, you can basically make use of all that. And I'll talk more about those in a second. But we've also built this with an agent-native platform. The goal, I think, of everybody in this room, especially for something like a hackathon, is you should just go in your application, design your UX, and then go Claude, look at the Inworld docs, and basically build this speech-to-speech pipeline for me. You shouldn't really need to do much more than that. So the idea behind the agent-native platform is this is not really like meant for humans anymore. It's meant for your Claude code to be able to be pointed at and for it to be able to build from. And so hopefully that works for you today and makes it easy to set up. And finally, just a bit about our inference engine. So all of these models run on top of this. And this is how, for example, we can have costs that are like 10 times cheaper than other providers. Because we've invested very deeply in basically a lot of kernel engineering, a lot of custom backends, a lot of custom work that allows us to squeeze more out of the compute, which means it can be cheap and it can be fast, in simple terms. And so hopefully people can play with this. Depending on what you're building, you may use one or each of these. If you end up scaling this up, let us know after, we can give you credits. And so finally, I think the key thing is to think about, first of all, if you're looking at each of the components that you're building for your voice agent today, what do you need? Like, what kind of voice do you need? Is it an empathetic voice? Is it an engaging voice? Is it motivating? What kind of speech to text? Is it a multilingual experience where you're going to have to touch lots of different languages? Is it something you're building only for English? How are you basically going to make sure that you're benchmarking what each of the different components needs to do for you? The second one is, how are you going to package these all together? So for example, with us, you just get unified billing. You can collect it all together. If you're going to use multiple providers, how are you going to think about all the limits and access and analytics on top of that? And finally, how are you going to basically put together your scorecard? So even today, it would be interesting, I think, if folks, as you built your application, you could even create like an adversarial approach using your agents, your Claude code, to say a lot of these, for example, Gemini and a few models are audio native, so they can actually understand experiences and give you benchmarks. So if you ask your agent to, for example, say, here's some audio recordings of my voice agent, what do you think? That's like the simple approach, but ideally, you can actually break it down to some evaluations and metrics that help you understand how you're progressing. And so, finally, just some points that I need to pitch my own company. Right now we have the fastest text-to-speech. So when I talk about latency stuff, if you use our real-time TTS2, secret is we just released the GA version of this silently. So if you use our latest model, it's actually a new model that was released just this week. And it's now the fastest in terms of median time to first audio. It's also, we did some private testing on this model this week, and it's actually the top of artificial analysis now. This is in private testing, so it's not public yet. Please, everyone, maybe keep this to yourself for the next week. But that will be live soon, too. So you should experience the great audio. It works well with cloning. You can also do voice design, so you can type in text and get the audio out. And then finally, when you're using our speech-to-text, right now it sits in the Pareto optimal point for word error rate and latency. Basically meaning it has a very low word error rate. It's also very fast. This is hard to do, so if you look at kind of where the Pareto optimal point is for a speech-to-text, those are the two things you usually look at, which is accuracy and latency. So if you're going to build it, use us. And just some ideas, maybe to seed some ideas for consumer spaces. So some of the groups we work with, TalkPal is a language learning app. Language learning, I think, is a really cool place to play as a voice agent builder because it allows you to touch a lot of things like multilingual, real-time experience. It has to have lots of voice understanding of things, not only like what's said, but how it's said in terms of the phonetic structure. If you're like a geek, language learning is a really fun place to play. Status is another app that basically does like a new form of social experience. They combine AI and human-generated content into a kind of new social platform. I think this is really creative because it brings together those things we've learned from the last few years about social media with this new form factor. And I think there's a lot that can be done in that audio space. They don't do a lot in audio right now, but if you think about the Twitter Spaces or these types of areas where we've seen, I think, the engagement that people get from audio, I think we've yet to see an AI native version of that. And finally, Latitude. People probably know AI Dungeon. It's been like a super old one now that's been around for a while. These guys are super innovative in the role-playing space, and this is a huge expanding category. You can think about D&D, Baldur's Gate style experiences where people are role-playing through types of like simulated experiences. This is exploding. I can tell you every app that we work with that is working in this space, people really love to role-play. They like to try out new experiences. And so if you're thinking about this, you can expand your horizon a little bit. Like, how could I try out different career paths by simulating what it's like to be in them, right? That's like if you want to go kind of geeky. On the other side, what is it like if I want to take my favorite book and simulate a role play through it? Those are the types of things that people really love, maybe because the real world is scary now, so they want to jump away. I don't know, but it's an expanding place. So these are just companies that I've seen be super successful, have grown to hundreds of millions of users, and I would say is a good maybe seeding point if you want to think about ideas. Great. So I want to summarize with that. Hopefully that was helpful. The key thing I want to say when you're thinking about what to build, start with a human moment that matters to you. Think about your parents, your family, your friends. Think about what would matter to them in the long run if you could build something that really matters to them. And then think about, how do I make a version of that that's going to get millions of people to spend 2 hours a day engaging with it? And if you can do that, you're going to have a hundreds of millions of dollar business. And so I think it's pretty motivating. Have fun building today, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Kylan. That was amazing. So while we're setting up our next speaker, would you like to answer some questions from the crowd?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Thank you.
So I've been using Gemini Live 3.1 speech-to-speech model. And I also implemented Inworld, and I was trying to get it to work so I could bring the unit economic costs down. I think what's your thoughts on these Cascade models versus speech-to-speech? And it seems like OpenAI has also been investing in speech-to-speech. Do you have that?
Yeah. So we are doing research in the speech-to-speech space, and we've thought about releasing a model sooner. The reason that we haven't is a lot of people will use these speech-to-speech models in prototyping, and then so far there's a few issues that have made it hard to use them in production. One is cost, as you mentioned. Another one is customization. So if you need custom voices, custom tool calling, it's really hard to bake those into the model. And so basically you lose a lot of the customization controls. And then finally, basically, if you think about the way that these models are built, they're basically if you look at how often a speech-to-speech model is released, it's once or twice a year. So their progress is very slow, which means that usually what happens is that by the time a speech-to-speech model comes out, a Cascade approach can use a latest LLM, the latest text-to-speech, the latest speech-to-text. So it's kind of this weird thing where speech-to-speech has this benefit of the audio context through. And so you can take advantage of that, but basically you lose out on a lot of the other innovations that are happening in the modeling space. So the way that we've tried to solve this in the midterm is to basically make our text-to-speech model audio native, which means it's kind of an in-between approach, which allows it to actually take in the audio from the user and condition on it, which is somewhat in between, which is the main thing that you lose when you use a traditional Cascade approach, is that you're losing the audio from the user as it's coming through. And so that's at least the bridge approach that we've taken. My future-looking approach is that speech-to-speech models will probably be a thin layer, similar to what Thinking Machines did with their demos. I don't know if you saw those, but basically it's a very thin, small model that actually orchestrating a bunch of other ones. I think that's probably the best approach because these huge, expensive, slow speech models are really hard to update and customize. So I think what we'll end up having is kind of an in-between approach where you have a thin layer of speech-to-speech that's then kind of calling specialized models for other functions. Yeah.
So what if you could update and customize them and modify them within minutes? What do you assume that technology already exists? What would that mean to the world in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say honestly, I think within 2 years, everybody will use speech-to-speech. So I think it's a matter of time, to be honest. And I think the other thing is that when you're starting to train these next generation models, even if we look at how we train text-to-speech, speech-to-text, we train it on duplex conversations. So we train it basically on understanding of back and forth, which means it's the way we're even training them, the data that we're giving them is the exact same you'd use for speech-to-speech. It just happens to be architecturally today, it's unwieldy to use the speech-to-speech models. But just if we look at hardware optimizations, inference optimizations, the latency, the cost issues will go away. The customization is just largely kind of a research problem of figuring out, how do you easily update custom voices into a massive baked model. Those kinds of things will be solved. So yeah, I think the simple answer is it'll be in the next 2 years with default, but I think at least today, Cascade still wins, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do the detection models, do they support natively switching languages in context?
Yeah, great question. Yes, so 2 of the main things that our text-to-speech model has is cross-lingual, which basically means it can speak technically 500 languages and switch between them natively. So you can, for example, feed in a string that's like a mix of Spanish, Japanese, and English, and it will switch between each of them while maintaining like a native accent for each. So this was the problem with last generation models, is you had to like specify a language, it would speak one language, and then if you had to switch to another language, it'd be like a different turn or basically a whole new session. And so now you can switch between them. So you can try it out, like go to the platform and just basically throw in a bunch of text that has like 10 different languages, and you'll see how it adapts to them. And this is kind of important because, especially in the US, many people speak bilingual, and so they'll actually switch between languages natively. And that's to the point of also making this more consumer native. Like, if that's how people talk, we should match how it works. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Any other questions? No? All right, cool. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, Kylan. That was great.